This is my third video on how Des Ford changed his thinking on the traditional Seventh-day Adventist interpretation of prophecy. And as I've mentioned before, I did this for a paper at the University of New England at Armidale, I think about 2009, but it could have been earlier. I've been talking about prophecy, the apotalismatic principle, and how it diluted the role of historicism. So Adventist scholars who were right-wing didn't like the idea. Moses Stewart and most other scholars in eschatology since believed that Antiochus IV Epiphanes, a Syrian king, was the son of perdition mentioned in Daniel 11. Antiochus had previously attacked Egypt twice, and the second time the Roman consul told him to withdraw from Egypt and Cyprus. In 168 BC, in revenge, he headed for Jerusalem, where he put many Jews to death in a most cruel way. He also ordered soldiers to slaughter a pig on the temple altar. They gave the cooked pig to some of the Jews and ordered them to eat it. When they didn't, they tortured, killed, and roasted them on the altar. This led to a Jewish rebellion, the War of the Maccabees, and defeated Antiochus's armies was sent to defeat them. That sentence doesn't read right, so I'll try it again. This led to a Jewish rebellion, the War of the Maccabees, and Antiochus's armies were sent to defeat them. On the way to deal with them, he suddenly died. Antiochus, that is. The Jewish version of what happened is written up in the apocryphal books 1 and 2 Maccabees. The Jewish holiday Hanukkah is a commemoration of this revolt. The question for Adventists is whether Antiochus Epiphanes appears in the book of Daniel. Some Adventist scholars have thought so, others not. Now, why would that be such a problem? Ford replies, the antagonism to the idea of Antiochus Epiphanes goes back to the beginning of our prophetic interpretation, when our men were afraid it would eclipse the bigger view of Rome. That's the reason for the antagonism. Remember, our early men like Uriah Smith had a very limited scholarly background and were mainly dependent on certain key books like Bishop Newton's Dissertation to the Prophecies, and they mainly copied from such books. But they failed to copy what such books had said about Antiochus Epiphanes because they were afraid it would blot out a larger view that could extend to 1844. The issue of Antiochus IV Epiphanes was discussed at length in the SDA 1919 Bible Conference. Reports from this conference were lost for over 50 years, but rediscovered in 1975 and partly republished in 1975 in Spectrum magazine. Ford included the section of the reports discussing Antiochus Epiphanes in his Glacier View manuscript. It's important because it's clear that some Adventist Bible administrators and scholars in 1919 believed Antiochus Epiphanes was referred to in the book of Daniel. Since Ford's trial at Glacier View, the Adventist Church has opposed the idea of recurring fulfillment in apocalyptic literature like Daniel, saying they can only accept it where Ellen White clearly uses it, as in Matthew 24 and Joel 2. Since Ford's trial at Glacier View, the Adventist Church has opposed the ideas of recurring fulfillment in apocalyptic literature like Daniel, saying they can only accept it where Ellen White clearly uses it, as in Matthew 24 and Joel 2. However, Ford got much of the structure for his ideas about the recurrent fulfillments of the abomination of desolation from comments of Ellen White in the Testimonies and in the last chapters of Great Controversy. White doesn't mention Antiochus by name, but she does say that the abomination and desolation in the first century typified events at the end of time. When Ford wrote his thesis, The Abomination of Desolation in Biblical Eschatology, for his second PhD at Manchester, he wrote about the restrainer of 2 Thessalonians 2, a topic that has historically been a crux interpretum, that means a very difficult text, and a hive of opposite ideas. Ford says Ellen White uses the concept of 2 Thessalonians 2, if not quoting the text, in chapters 37 to 39, I believe of great controversy, where various forms of the word restrain are used with the biblical idea 5 times. F. Bruce, Ford's professor, said Ford's work on the restrainer was his unique contribution to knowledge in his thesis. Ford says he got the clues on how to put his ideas together from Ellen White. Now remember that in scholarly work you can only quote scholars, so he would not have been able to use Ellen White as a source. Nevertheless, she was his source. Des doesn't know whether Ellen White borrowed those ideas, but they seem unique to him, different to anything that the other pioneers said. The pioneers of Adventism, including White's husband James, had different views to Ellen White. Ford said, "When I read her chapter, God's People Delivered, it is so different to what Adventism teaches elsewhere, it's just remarkable." Ford's first problem with the Adventist traditional viewpoint began at age 15, when he read Hebrews 9. He comments it seems to be saying that the Day of Atonement applied to the crucifixion of Christ. He found the more widely he read, the more questions he had about the fundamentalist Adventist views that he first encountered. Ford was continually reading books written against Adventism, as well as those books about the pillars of faith of Adventism. He was writing a question and answer column in the Australasian Sign of the Times beginning in 1951 and lasting for over 30 years. In Ford's later ministry, he was a member of committees both in the USA and Australia, hearing and countering arguments against Adventist doctrines, dealing with heresy. So he was faced with such issues constantly. He also talked to many people on both sides of the fence, including teachers at Potomac University, where he did his master's degree in the late 1950s. Ford comments, "The situation at the Adventist University at Washington, D.C. was very different to the situation in Australia. This was in the early 1950s. The situation at the Adventist University at Washington, D.C. was very different to the situation in Australia. Most of the men there with doctorates have gotten their doctorates at non-Adventist universities in the earlier years." This was in the early 1950s. And their views were much broader than the traditional Adventist views, so I became acquainted with these views early on. I found that my problems with Daniel 8:14 were shared by a number of the teachers. For instance, the Greek teacher, Dr. Roland E. Loseby. Ivan Blazon was another. I don't have that written down, but he's in there. I found that Heppenstall was wrestling with the problems, and there were others dubious about the traditional views. Even one of my fellow students, who was later to become a well-known professor in Adventism teaching at Andrews, had all the same problems and had gone further than I had in dismissing the doctrine. It was rather bewildering in that I knew I was being called to go back and teach orthodox views, and yet the men that were now my teachers and guides were not themselves orthodox. I did a paper for Dr. Hilgert. He talked to me about it. It was very clear he did not hold to 1844, an investigative judgment or anything of that nature. He was a fine scholar, a Christian gentleman, and an excellent teacher, and so I had to take seriously his concerns and give him further attention in the years that followed. Because of all these different views and untraditional views, I was deeply perplexed about my future. A few years earlier, while travelling long distance one night, Ford had confided his concerns to Pastor David Sibley, the Trans-Tasman president and later the division secretary. To Ford's amazement, Sibley knew all about the problems with the investigative judgment. He'd been asked to deal with W. Fletcher, who taught against the traditional views of prophecy in the 1930s. Sibley had studied the issues and decided that Fletcher was correct. He told Ford that God used the Calvinists and they were wrong on predestination. He used the Methodists, though they were wrong. Made a mistake there. About sanctification, I suppose. Sibley said, God has used different groups all through the ages despite their errors. And God can use Adventism because there's many good things in it. Ford later recounted his problems to Sibley. Look, in America at the seminary, they don't believe in the investigative judgment. What do I do? Sibley replied, you tell the boys, your students, the problems. Give them the best answer you can come up with. So that's what I did all the time I was at Avondale. Ford had not yet fully dismissed the traditional teaching of 1844, and he continued to write many articles for church papers, wrestling with the problems, giving a broader view, teaching Avondale students the problems, giving them the best answers he knew.